In this second of a four-part interview with Robyn, Fivush, and Marshall Duke, professors of psychology at Emory University, they elucidate the kinds of stories that our children need to hear and how small, everyday stories can have a big impact on our children's development. They explain why these simple stories provide children a context for knowing who they are, how to live, and how to relate to the world around them. So let's get to it. You both talk about a term that you call it intergenerational narratives. So I guess this ties in, Robyn, to this idea of having an elder who is there to tell the stories.
I think that's right, Rick. And I do think that it's important that there be good storytellers in the family. But I also want to make the point that not all family stories have to be wonderful, elaborate, interesting, fascinating stories. Sometimes the most important stories that families tell and retell and really consider defining for who they are of the most silly or mundane experiences. So families will often ask, parents often ask me, well, is it important that I tell stories about this or about that? It's like, no, it just matters that you tell stories. So I do want to say a couple of things about that as well, because one of the tools that Marshall and I developed is called the Do You Know scale, or the 20 questions scale. And it is kind of a rough and ready index of whether or not this is a storytelling family, because it asks adolescents or young adults to just check off yes or no. Do you know this story? Do you know where your grandmother went to elementary school? Do you know where your grandfather got his first job? But we want to be very clear that it's not about knowing those particular facts or those particular stories. It's just that that's a rough and ready index of kind of, this is a family that must tell stories, because how else would this adolescent or young adult know this information? So what I want to stress to families is that stories come up in snippets, in small moments. Those small stories can be just as important as the big stories that we always tell again and again over Thanksgiving dinner. Uncle Louie, don't forget to tell the story about the time you drove the truck into the ditch, which becomes an emblematic family story and certainly serves an important function. But the small little stories also are important, the everyday stories.
When you think about the dynamics in families today, although it's so interesting in this time of COVID, what is how families have been impacted because they're spending more time together than they used to. But in terms of intergenerational sharing, how often kids and grandparents are living in a different city. So they're not, it's not like in the old days where, everyone lived in the same town and, you always went over to grandma's for Saturday or Sunday dinner or whatever. And so, it's interesting just from a sociological perspective, what's happening to families that maybe make it very hard to have a storyteller there. And I think a lot of adults today that you can say, well, why don't you tell a story? And they go, well, I'm not much of a storyteller, And so it's an interesting phenomenon happening today from a sociological perspective. Did you seen anything in terms of certain kinds of families that do better or that seem to have a storyteller, or is distance a determining factor any longer? Maybe FaceTime does it.
The I guess need for and emergence of things like Zoom, Skype, has allowed for the storytellers sometimes to be in touch with the kids when they wouldn't be because of distance or because of lockdown or things of that sort. So it is possible. But what Robyn is saying, I want to just emphasize, and that is that these are not big stories, nor are they complete stories. One of the things that I have found in some work that I've been doing over the past couple of years is that the stories, the narratives that kids carry really come from, they're probably more than this, but I can tell you 3 sources. And one is the words that they hear. or the things that they read. A story that's transmitted actually, as one child said, Grandpa, tell me a story from your mouth. Stories from their mouths. The second is behavior. That is, without words, grandparents or storytellers tell things to their grandchildren based upon how they act. And this is something that's really very apparent. And for example, the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors with whom I've been working over the past couple of years, that their grandparents act in certain ways that tell about their approach to the world. People who have absolutely no worries about their next meal will worry about their next meal. They will not trust people who are eminently trustable, but their behavior shows this. And what happens is that the stories that they get come in fragments. So there's a fragment of a story, that's a small one. Something is said about Grandpa or Uncle Joe or something. And then over time, the kids begin to fill in the blanks of the stories. So there's an active component in the story listener and the recipient. And the fragments sometimes are filled in with actual fact and sometimes filled in with general information. So if I know that my grandparent grew up in New York City in 1920, I don't know for a fact that my grandmother wore a flapper dress, but I can imagine that she did because I know the history of the time. And so I can fill in a detail. And so the words, the behaviors, and the fragments are put together to create the narrative. But I think, as Robyn has shown, the narrative is in the child, in the recipient, and that's who carries it. So this is the intergenerational component. Certainly there is a source which is active, but also a source which is kind of a passive component.
So
yeah, I'd like to add a couple of things to that. One is, I think that question makes us be more explicit about why stories matter, right? Why not just more general communication? And we know that families that communicate more openly and more directly also has positive outcome for the child. So, stories are not the only way to get positive child outcome, but stories play a special role. So what is it about stories? Stories are lived experience. These are the actual lived experiences of your parents and grandparents in ways that make it more real for you than just hearing about things abstractly or hypothetically. These are people you love and identify with, and they're talking about things that they have personally experienced. And in telling the story, they're almost always providing information both about who they are as a person, but also, as Marshall was saying, how to live in the world. What does it mean to be a person? What does it mean to live in the world? What does it mean to have a good life? And in fact, in several studies, we've asked adolescents and young adults, why do you think your parent or your grandparent told you this story? And invariably, the answers we get are so that I would understand who they are as a person and to teach me a lesson about the world. So this is very explicitly in the adolescent's mind. They know this is the function of the story. This is how they use the story. The other thing that I want to emphasize for particularly parents, maybe grandparents as well, we've done now several studies where we've asked adolescents or young adults to tell us stories they know about their parents' childhood. And then we go back to the parent and we say, oh, your daughter told us about, the day you won the high school swimming championship. And almost all the time the parent says, are you serious? I didn't think she was even listening when I told that story. She was rolling her eyes. But in fact, adolescents are listening, and they're listening closely. We've now interviewed hundreds of adolescents from all walks of life, both in this country, and we've now done cross-cultural work. Adolescents, well over 90% of them, are easily able to tell you stories about their parents and grandparents. They are hearing these stories. They are listening, and they actually enjoy telling us these stories. They always say things like, I wish I knew more about my mom's growing up. So my I always, because I know parents, particularly when, adolescents say they're not listening, they're rolling their eyes. It's like, yes, that may be what they're showing you, but it's not what they're actually doing.